Ever since you can remember, you felt something in your chest telling you to move, to love, to speak, to try. Day after day, you pretend you don't hear it calling, or maybe you dismiss it as silliness or worse. But it's there, ready for you, and it will wait for you as long as you need. My name is Johnny G, and I invite you to join me on a journey of awakening as we dare to embrace our light. This is Refractive. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Refractive Podcast. I'm your host, Johnny G. Today, I have with me Tim Olson. Tim is an author, educator, business owner, and a life coach. His understanding of father-child relationships was fostered through years of study, observation, and application as not only a teacher and principal, but as a coach to personal and business clients around the world, and in working with the National Fathering Ministry in both Minnesota and Ukraine. Tim is a Master's of Education from the University of Minnesota, a Master's Equivalency in Learning Disabilities, and certifications in Business Management and Life Coach Training. And so I'm really happy to have you on the show with us today, Tim. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for having me.
Of course. When you and I crossed paths and I heard about your book and the topic, I really thought this was a valuable subject to talk about on a show like this. You know, this is a spirituality podcast, and your work and expertise has a lot to do with, let's say, the role of fathers and men in society. And a lot of the focus of the work that I do with my coaching clients and the topics that I talk about on this show, it's about finding the role in life that feels authentic and nourishing and powerful for yourself and moving towards that. And I know growing up in Louisiana that there's a lot of people out there who become parents before they wanted to, before they were prepared. And we can see the impact of people who unfortunately pass on the pain that they've absorbed to the next generation. So I think the idea of understanding the power of the role of men in our society and the role of the father, and taking ownership and responsibility of that power, I think it's a really important spiritual topic, and I'm excited to talk about it. You have a book that you are re-releasing, and I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about the title of the book and maybe a high-level summary of the subject matter.
Sure. The book is called The Legacy of Absence, and the subtitle really tells it all. It says, Resolving the Wounds from Uninvolved Fathers in Individuals, Families, and Society. And I wrote the book, or the idea of the book came to me as I was working with mostly business owners as a life coach, a business life coach. And they were bringing up all of these issues around their business problems that they were having. And I realized eventually that, wait a minute, these issues really are not rooted in business. They're rooted in the relationships. And I was also working with this fathering ministry that you listed, and learning more and more about what it means to be a father and the impact of that. Now, by that time, I was already a father and a grandfather, so I had had a lot of awareness and experience in that area. And but I kept learning more and more, and it blew me away how much I was learning. And the executive director was my client at the time, but I eventually became a presenter myself in the organization because it was so meaningful to me. And as I combined these two, the business and the father role material, more and more started to come to light to me that these things really are connected. And so I wrote the book as a business book originally. And my editor at the time said to me, you know, this is more of a broader audience topic than business. So why don't you think of that as maybe your second book and do this as a more general audience? And so that's what I ended up doing. But I do have material in there. I start off first chapter with a story from business, and I revisit that along the way a number of times. But as I worked with these business owners, we would talk about the surrounding issues with their family, and usually an owner with his children coming into the business, or with the children running the business and their father, who may or may not still be in the business, or not in the business. And what I realized is that when we address that problem, or whatever problems were manifested there, that the business issues tended to take care of themselves. And that's a pretty powerful thing. Now, you'll hear that in family business, especially from all of the business gurus and so on who talk about this. And they focus more on the relationship within the whole family. But because of my experience and training in this, I've been able to say, you know, it's really more defined than that even. It really has to do much more with the father himself.
Wow.
So much so that I even make a comment in the introduction and on the back cover of the book that says that we can trace almost all, and there's evidence to this, we can trace almost all of the problems in society back to the root cause of fathers not being involved with their children. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement.
That's a big statement. Yeah.
In fact, I used to say all of the problems, and then I realized, well, no, there's always got to be some things that that don't quite fit. So what I realized with that more and more was that there are aspects of our identity that are fulfilled by the father far more than just the mother. Each parent has different roles, which I think is obvious, but they tend to be in such a way that they fit the general population. And there, again, there's always some people that don't quite fit. So, you know, keep that in mind when I say this, that the mother's primary role is to provide a safe place, the nest, more or less. Now, a lot of women, before they have children, will say, well, no, I don't fit that. But then when they become mothers, then they start to, oh yeah, okay, I understand that now. And so it is to provide a safe place, a nest, and to nourish. They nourish and protect and raise their children in that way. And the primary role then of the father is to prepare the children to actually leave the nest. Now that might sound contrary, but it's not, because they're designed to work together to provide the most ideal setting for children. And along with that, the father actually provides 4 primary areas of influence.
All right.
So he helps them develop confidence. Mother can do this too, but again, it's really designed. Everything we do shows that it's designed primarily come from the father. Confidence, self-esteem, maturity, and especially identity. And identity has to do with who we are and the fact that we are loved and we are accepted for who we are. And this identity is something that I have found out is something that we all search for, to get from our fathers.
Yeah.
Or we get it from our fathers, even though as kids we don't realize that's what we're getting. And that's the main source. But it is the main source. And if we don't get it from the father because he's uninvolved in some way, physically gone or emotionally and psychologically, spiritually, and so on, uninvolved with his kids, that we will continue to look for it the rest of our lives in inappropriate ways and find inappropriate answers.
Yeah. Unless
there's some kind of an intervention that helps us to resolve it. Now, for me, my dad was at home. He worked, but he was at home a lot, and he was part of the family, but he was not involved in my own life one-to-one. And that we have labeled that the passive father.
The
And
passive
the
father.
passive father. And
Okay.
this is a large group. I think this is, in fact, the biggest group of fathers.
Hmm.
And when I talk to people about this definition, they'll often say, "Oh, that was my dad." And they didn't have words for it before. So the word passive has been a very helpful thing for people to grab onto that one.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so he was there, but not involved in my own life. And so I too was having to search in ways, how do I find my identity, who I am,
Hmm.
without realizing that primarily just means um, that I know who I am, and I'm loved and accepted for that. I was a
Hmm.
loving family, and so that was pretty obvious. But again, not getting it from dad makes a difference. And
Hmm.
so when I was a dad, my kids were young. I was involved. I attended a church, a small church, and there were a handful of men who were really great dads, and
Hmm.
they were role models for me. And that was, for me, that was the intervention. It wasn't a direct intervention like you think of with counselors and so on. It was just by me observing them,
Okay.
interacting with them, and so on, where I started to realize, these are things that I want. I
Yeah.
want to be like them. And
Hmm.
so mentoring and modeling is really a huge thing for men. In fact, there's an author by the name of Stu Weber who wrote a book called The Four Pillars of a Man's Heart.
Hmm.
Great book. And he mentioned in there that being a father has very little to do with uh, heredity or the fact that these are born from me. Uh, it has everything to do with being a father, by nurturing as a father to other people around us.
Okay.
And that was a great thing to hear as well, because it affected me then as a teacher and as a principal and in those various roles.
I wonder if I can ask you, like, that at that point where you were going to church and you encountered these men that you saw as good fathers, how old were you when you started this process of, let's say, transferring that role model status from your biological father to these surrogate fathers?
That was primarily, I would say, between ages of 25 and 30. That's when it
Okay.
had the biggest impact.
Okay, so now in the time of that experience, I'm really curious about this. I think it's fascinating
Sure.
because I think a lot of us go through this, but we don't
Hmm.
take the time to pick it apart and really look back and say, well, what was happening when I was around this role model or this figure that
Yes.
impacted my life? I wonder, were you conscious of the fact that you were maybe placing these men in this pseudo father position, or is it something that you see clearly from hindsight, but in the moment you weren't aware?
I was aware of noticing them and the impact they had, the influence they had on their kids and on other people they related to. That was evident to me, and I knew I wanted that. So
Okay.
I tried to model after it.
Okay, so you can see after the fact today, you're like, okay, so this was the education experience I had that kind of almost like bumped me to start flowing in a different direction for myself. I saw this, I had influence from this group of people that kind of changed my path a bit.
Yes, very much so. Then at the same time, along with that question, I'd have to say that in working with the father ministry, that was when I started to consciously evaluate my own father
Mm,
more
okay.
and understand what was happening, and my mother too,
Mhm.
and start to really pick that apart and analyze it. And that's when I realized that my father was passive because my mother was very domineering. She
Okay.
was the dominant player, and
Mhm.
she's the one who knew what was really going on in my life. Uh, but she was dominant in such a way that it made him be even more passive, as she was the decision maker. And
Mhm.
And part of that was that she had two characteristics about her leadership that made that possible. And one of them was that she was very performance based, which
Okay.
means how things look matters more than how things really are.
Yeah.
And so she would make that very common statement, well, what will the neighbors think? Or what will the relatives think, about my behavior, things that I would do and say, or how I would look. And we all do that. We are a performance-based society or a performance-based world. And so that's not unusual. However, some people take it to a certain extent that's rather extreme. And
Yeah.
I believe that she did. So in addition to being performance-based, my mom was also very shame-based.
Okay.
And so not only did things go wrong in terms of how I might look or behave, shame on you for doing it. And what we know about shame is that it's different from guilt. Guilt is a matter of my deciding what to do
Okay.
and choosing what to do. I might choose to speed down the highway. I
Yeah.
might choose to say wrong things to people or to lie and so on.
Hmm.
But that's a matter of choice. Shame, on the other hand, is about my character. It attacks who I am. Now, my dad is supposed to build up who I am through identity,
Mm-hmm.
but through shame, it tears you down.
Okay.
And she wasn't doing that intentionally. She believed that shame would change my behavior. But in reality, it just attacks me. And so in the future, when the same thing happens, I haven't heard why it was wrong. I just knew that I was wrong for doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's an element there that was missing. So as I grew up, I realized that one of the things that I was missing was confidence. I ended up being very quiet. Now,
Hmm.
that doesn't have to necessarily be negative,
Right.
but I was often very quiet just because I was too ashamed to stand up and say something.
Okay.
I was too immature to do it.
Hmm.
I know that because my father was passive, and this happens. This is true. When the father is passive, the kids tend to be passive.
Okay, because you
And
mentioned that one of the four aspects of identity that comes from the father is confidence.
exactly, right.
Okay.
And so when he didn't have confidence, I didn't have confidence. And so it took me many more years to develop confidence, self-esteem, maturity, and
Mm.
my identity as to who I really felt I was.
Okay. You have a significant part of this book, The Legacy of Absence, that talks about the father wound. And I wonder if you can explain that concept to us.
The father wound is so evident when we do our work in places like halfway houses, men coming out of prison and into society or out of rehab. And they are struggling with the very things that I've mentioned already, but they haven't been able to put their fingers on exactly what's happening there. And what I've noticed is that these men absolutely and women absolutely hate their fathers. It's incredible. And we go through the process of trying to resolve some of that wound. But that wound is without the father being involved. The wound is like having a hole in your heart with no bottom to it. And we all tend to want to have a father who, especially when we're growing up, who is our hero. And we soon learn that the dad isn't perfect enough to really be a hero, and yet
Yeah.
that's the relationship that we want. And we learn and grow so much from that. And so in a way, it's really a part of life that later on we know how to deal with the struggles of life because of having an absent father. But the roots of so much of that is in that lacking relationship with dad. And that's what we call the wound. In fact, now this gets into the spiritual area quite a bit. And so this may be a surprise to a lot of people, but if you look at the Bible in the Old Testament, the very last chapter of the Old Testament, there's a verse there that says, that when Elijah come, which is a reference to John the Baptist and Jesus coming in the New Testament, it says that he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or I will visit the earth with a curse. And we believe, all of the research and so on, the people I've connected to on all sides of this issue, believe that the curse is fatherlessness.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the wound shows up is without the father being involved, it shows up in poor health, poor education, poorer finances,
Mm-hmm.
more crime, all of the negative aspects of life. That's why I said earlier that we can see that almost all of the issues or the problems in society refer back to the absent father, the uninvolved
Mm-hmm.
father,
Mm-hmm.
because without him there, all of these things tend to become issues.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Go ahead.
Excuse me. There's a study that I referred to in my book, who by a doctor who evaluated 3 different settings. And what he was after was to discover what the pathological likelihood, or let me phrase that, there would be the likelihood of pathological behavior in the children in 3 different settings.
Mm-hmm.
And one setting was a mother and father who are both present and both working together to be good parents. And the likelihood of pathological behavior with their children is 5%. There's always the chance of kids doing that. And the second group was with mothers who were the single parent. The father was not involved in the kids' lives. The likelihood of pathological behavior in those children jumped to 30%. That's a pretty big jump.
Yeah.
However, the third group was a father involved with the mother. I'm sorry, the father present with the mother and the children, but not really involved.
Okay.
And not
That's
a
the
real
passive
strong,
that you're talking about, right?
exactly, the passive, but also not a very strong relationship between the mother and the father.
Okay.
So there's this conflict setting. The likelihood of pathological behavior in those children jumped to 60%.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
That is fascinating.
That's why I think that group of pathological behavior is not only the biggest group of fathers, but it's also the most dangerous group.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
It can be worse than having the father just not even involved.
Well, that segues us really nicely to our next topic, which, I'm fascinated about how you wrap up the book talking about steps to move forward, right? So like, okay, so this is my situation, this is my background and my history. And so now what? Like, what do I have what I have? So now,
Yes.
and you talk about the concept of accepting our imperfection. And from a spiritual perspective, this is big for me, right? Like I mean, I have an episode of my podcast titled "Making Peace with Our Dark Side." So, the idea of saying, "Here's my imperfect situation, and let's say the impact that I have psychologically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually from my childhood. And so now what do I do?" And so I wonder what advice and suggestions you might have for people who didn't have an ideal childhood of balance. And I think that's a key word that you mentioned earlier, having an ideal balanced childhood. How do you recommend they move forward other than, of course, traditional therapy and whatnot?
Yes, that's a great question. And ultimately, the purpose of my book is reconciliation, reconciling the relationship between any of us and our fathers, and any of us and our children. And your question really is, how do you even come to that point? And it takes a lot of understanding in the first place. And so, for instance, with these men who hate their fathers, it's like, what an ideal place to start and say, how do you get from here to there?
Yeah.
And one of the statements that we typically make is that your future success is tied to your relationship with your father. And if you think about that for a while, it's going to force you to say, wow, I want to be successful in the future in various aspects of life. I'm going to have to approach this and do something about it. If you don't address it, there's a great quote that says, if we do not intentionally approach the issues in our lives, we will most assuredly pass them on to the next generation. And so that's another thing. Do I want this to go on or not?
Right.
When do I have time to throw in a short story?
Yeah, go ahead.
When my oldest son was about 13 years old, my folks came up from Chicago to Minneapolis to visit us. And I thought I had a great idea. We both played music instruments, my son and I. Why don't we play a duet for them? And
Can't
what a
wait.
nice
Can't
thing to
wait
do.
hear. I can't.
My son said, or my son, of course, is 13. How interested are they in doing something like that? Not very. And so my folks were sitting there and we were setting up, and my son just was not cooperating very well. And finally, I just kind of had enough of it, and I nudged him with my elbow, and I just said, "Why don't you just forget it and go in your room?" And I was kind of exasperated. So he did. He was glad to do it. And my folks were sitting there. I turned around and I was really embarrassed because I work with kids of that age all day long, 250, 300 kids a day. And I was known for being quite good at it. And I apologized to them. And my mom justified what had just happened. She said, well, you know, what you did is just part of who you are, because your dad is just like that. He's sitting right there, and he agreed. It's this temper that flares, and it's kind of like a temper tantrum in a way, is I think a good way to describe it, but it's part of anger. And she said, not only that, but his father was worse than he is, and his father was even worse yet. And so what happened in my mind was this immediate realization or understanding of another verse from the Bible that says the sins of the fathers will be visited on their children to the third generation. And of course, it keeps on going longer than that because the sin keeps getting repeated. And so I always thought that that verse had to do with things from the Ten Commandments, adultery and murder and things like that. And I hadn't been done any of those. But then I realized, wait a minute, this also is not from God. So it can't be a good thing. And so I said, excused myself from them. And I said, I have to go in and see my son for a moment here. And I went into him and I said, Dave, I need to talk to you for a minute and ask your forgiveness for two things. I said, the first thing is what just happened out there wasn't your fault. It was mine. And so would you please forgive me for treating you the way I did?
Yeah.
Fortunately, he said, yeah. He said, yes, that'd be okay. Then I said, the other thing is what just happened out there is a generational problem. And I explained to him what my mom just described to me. And I had known about that before, but it just became very vivid to me.
Yeah.
And so I described that to him. And I said, the reason I need to ask your forgiveness for something else is I can see that am already passing this on to you. And I am really sorry about that. And he, again, knew exactly what I was talking about because he saw it in himself. And I said, would you please forgive me for that? And he was glad to do that because he didn't want to have any part of it.
Yeah.
And so I said, with God's help, with mom's help, with my help and your help, would you be willing to work with me on this to resolve this issue? And he said yes, because again, he didn't want it.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you, he's 55 today, and he's one of the gentlest men I know. Now that issue will still flare up in both of us from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
We are all imperfect. We're all, struggling with these things, but it changed both of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, again, to answer your question, it's a matter of understanding how these things impact and a willingness to to kind of bare ourselves
Yes.
and address them. And going to our fathers or going to our children is a part of reconciliation. But
Mhm.
one of the main steps in reconciliation is forgiveness.
Yeah.
And we might say, well, let me throw this in. If people go to my website, they can get a document, a free document that I put together that is called Getting Back with Dad,
Okay.
the whys, the benefits, and the excuses,
Hmm.
and things that we all go through. But we need to evaluate those things before we are willing to forgive and take the steps of reconciliation, which aren't in that document, but they are in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we are not typically ready to forgive. And I describe why and how that all works in
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
So have I addressed your question?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many thoughts that come to mind that we won't have time to talk about. Everything from spiritual bypass and
Yes.
and all of that. But what I hear you saying is perfectly in step with what I hear so many spiritual teachers throughout history say, which is, when something is weighing you down, whether it's your own character, uh, traits, whether it is life and situations, the way to heal is to sit with it as long as you can, right? To just sit with it, be with it,
Yes.
acknowledge it, become one with it, recognize it, and let it do what it needs to do in a safe, protected space, which is time you've set aside to feel the feelings and have the thoughts and all of that. And rather than what I tend to do, I don't know about you, Tim, but like, which is let's watch another episode of the show, or let's go quiet this down with some food, or let's go
Yes.
do some online shopping to just numb it
That's
instead
right.
of actually sitting with it. So that's what I hear your suggestion of when you have these imperfections, as you call them in the book, when you have this legacy of imperfection, to walk up to it, shake its hand, sit down with it, and just get to know it as well as you can.
Yes. In fact, I'm re-releasing my book with coaching questions at the end of each chapter
Mm-hmm.
to help readers, not just to say, well, that was an interesting chapter, let's read the next one,
Yeah.
but be drawn to go a little deeper.
Yeah, good. And so let's say the listeners today have really resonated with your message and the topics we've discussed. How can they learn more about you, the work you've done, the services and tools that you offer?
Yes, my website is timolsonauthor.com, and Olson is Olson, not En.
Okay.
And so that's one place. They can also get my book. They can go on Amazon to get that. And from time to time, and I do have free ebook downloads. And
The book
but
is The
there's
Legacy of Absence,
the
right? The
legacy of
Legacy of
absence,
Absence. Okay.
resolving the wounds from uninvolved fathers, and that's in paperback or in ebook. And the father ministry might be of interest also to some people, and that's dadsfirst.org.
That's a good
And
website, I gotta say.
yeah,
I mean, that's a great URL.
yeah, Dad's First came from a fuller statement of Dad's first responsibility is to the family,
Okay.
and we shortened it to Dad's First. And
Hmm.
that's really the street name, we call it, of the National Fathering Ministry. And so those are basically the resources that I have.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing the years of observation and experience, the insights that you developed from your own past, the work you've done with other people. I really think that this is such a valuable topic. I know that not all of my listeners will agree with everything that you've said. I know that there's a lot of divine feminine, divine masculine, gender identity things that we did not go into. We don't have the
Right,
time to go
right.
into those levels. But I think that just because other aspects may also be true doesn't mean that this aspect is not true. And I think that it's worth digging into, it's worth absorbing, it's worth finding the space where your experience can bring value to someone else. So thank you for sharing that today.
You're welcome. Thank you for your perspective as well.
Absolutely. Everyone, it was great to have you tune in again to another episode of Refractive. And as always, as you go out into the world today, remember to aim your light. Take care. You've been listening to Refractive Podcast, and this is Johnny G. If you found today's content uplifting, if you think it might make somebody's day better, give it a share on social media, click like, subscribe. All those things help to expand this podcast's availability to new audiences. I'm a speaker, a coach, and a facilitator based out of Washington, D.C., but I travel a lot. If you think I can be of service to you or to your organization, help people get unstuck or move into their authentic power, shoot me an email. My email address is refractivepodcast@gmail.com. Take care. Thanks for listening, and aim your light.